This over here is an RTX 4080 Super, but this is also an RTX 4080 Super, except it is so much smaller, it's better looking, and it's cheaper, believe it or not. Now, is this thing even worth it? Why should you be buying? What's the performance like? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be answering in this video. Let's go. Licensing Windows is cheap and easy with whokeys.com, and if you use the code TN20, you get an extra discount. Complete the purchase, copy the key, and paste it to the activation settings. And you're all done. Also, check out their Microsoft Office 19 license and use the same code TN20 for the extra discount. Check out whokeys.com in the video description below. Now, these cards are called the ASUS Tuf RTX 4080 Super OC, which is the bigger card. And then we have the ASUS ProArt OC card, which is this smaller one over here. As you can see, the smaller one is quite a bit skinnier, shorter than and narrower than the Tuf card. Tuf card is massive. The Tuf is actually the 4090 cooler. The 4090 is exactly the same size, so it's a little bit oversized cooler. But there are a few other differences what we can see here. The Tuf also has dual BIOS, which you can see over here, the quiet and performance mode, which we don't have on the ProArt. There is none of the switches in there. But also the power cable is the other way on the ProArt or on the Tuf, which is a little bit weird because where you have this locking latch on the ProArt, that's underneath, which means if you try to remove the power cable on the ProArt, it is extremely difficult because you can't really get your finger underneath there because the heatsink's on the way where you have to do that. It's so much easier with the Tuf because you just have the latch on the top and you can easily remove it. Another thing we can notice is that the heat pipes and the heat sink or radiator is silver on the Tuf, which on most cards it is silver, but on the Tuf it is actually painted matte black, which is really nice. So looking at the cards on the back, I really like the ProArt design. It is so nice. You can see how big the Tuf is and the pass-through is absolutely insane. The ProArt also has pass-through. The design is pretty nice, but not as big as on the Tuf. Now this is probably the nicest bit of the ProArt. So if you want to vertical mount your GPU, then seeing this to me is so much nicer than seeing the Tuf in here. I love the minimalistic ProArt design. Now the fans are smaller and skinnier compared to the Tuf here, but nicer looking to me. But we'll see in a minute if that makes a difference. Looking at the tops of the GPUs, both of them have these screw holes. So if any of the SI partners want to make their own custom kind of a CPU or GPU sag bracket that they screw into, then they can do it on both of them. And we're looking at the I/O. You can see that the Tuf has one extra HDMI port, but that doesn't mean that it supports more display outputs. This is just an extra HDMI port. You can still support 4, if I'm not mistaken, on both of these GPUs. Just on the Tuf, you can go 2 HDMIs and 2 display ports, whereas on the ProArt, we only have 1 HDMI and 3 display ports. Interestingly, even though the Tuf is a 3-slot card, or probably even more, the I/O back bracket that actually screws onto the PC is still only 2 slots thick. It could have been 3 to get even more leverage and kind of a locking it in and not as much sag on there, but for some reason they haven't done that. Now, if you want to see actual my build on this, I had a PC build where we had 2 of these in the PC. So check out the ultimate Creator Dream PC. And it was a little bit of a different video than what we do. It's definitely worth checking out. I'll leave that in the description below, as well as these cards if you want to pick them up. What about the performance then? Now, I'm not going to make an RTX 4080 Super review. If you want to check that one out, I've got that on the channel where we compare it with AMD and some of the other cards. Right now, we're just looking at the ProArt 4080 Super and see if this card in performance is any different than the Tuf and is it worth getting? Because once we get to the price point later on in the video, you'll be very surprised what the prices are. Firstly, Geekbench checks, we can see the Tuf and ProArt in there. Tuf is the baseline, ProArt is what we're going to be calculating the percentages off. And you can see that the ProArt is between 1.1 to 2.8% difference, a little bit slower for some reason, but this is within margin of error, so we can move on. They look the same in Geekbench 6. Now, moving on to Photoshop, that doesn't necessarily use a lot of GPU, but it's still some of the features are supported in there. We can see that the ProArt is 1.26% on average higher than the Tuf card. But again, don't be buying the ProArt over the Tuf just because you're doing Photoshop. In fact, if you want to do this for Photoshop, go have a look at my Intel Arc review, because there might be a lot more, like 3 times cheaper cards that perform better for Photoshop, so go check that one out. Now moving on to video editing and Adobe Premiere Pro. So this is the Geekbench 0.98 in Premiere Pro 23.6. And you can see that, again, the cards perform very, very similar. The ProArt is 0.16% faster in extended overall scores and about 0.58% slower in the standard overall scores. So this is within margin of error, there's basically no difference. You can't tell the difference, they perform exactly the same. The GPU effects is a little bit slower on the ProArt, what we can see. Bear in mind, this is an average of about 5, 6, 7 tests calculated and made sure that there's no flukes in the benchmarks, but they perform the same in Premiere Pro. Moving on to After Effects, very similar story. The ProArt is a little bit slower compared to the Tuf, but a little bit faster in some of the other scores, but overall they're within margin of error, within 1%, and we're talking about within half of the 1%, they're performing the same. Moving on to DaVinci Resolve, that really loves to use a lot of GPU, and here we can see very similar results. The ProArt is less than 0.5% slower than the Tuf, which means these cards are exactly the same. I can't see any difference in any of the video photo editing applications. What about 3D applications now? So firstly, V-Ray, we can see that the ProArt, a little bit bigger gap now than to the Tuf, is 1.4% slower in the RTX score and about 2.3% slower in the GPU score. So it's still within the margin of error, I'd say, between 2-3%. You're not going to notice the difference. Anything above that, we can really start to say one is a little bit better than the other one, but still, you're not going to notice 5% difference. In the Blender, this is Blender 3.6. For some reason, Blender above 3.6, like 4 or 4.1, they perform slower than 3.6, so I'm keeping benchmarking for 3.6 for now until I can see the performance stabilize. Do you notice the same thing? Let me know. I've seen some people do that same, but what about you? Let me know in the comment section below. The ProArt is about 2.7% slower in the monster scene, 1.2% slower in the junk shop scene, and classroom scene is 0.4% faster, which means, again, within margin of error, you're not going to notice that difference. Octane Bench, here the ProArt is 0.3% slower. Again, within margin of error, no difference there. Redshift, here we see the biggest difference of all the benchmarks. The ProArt is 4.05% slower than the Tuf. So here we can probably see that somehow, whether this is thermal constraints or for some reason, the ProArt is a little bit slower and the Tuf is faster. But generally, these cards have identical performance and they perform within margin of error. Now, if we really split the hair, then we can see that the Tuf is probably in ideal conditions slightly faster, probably because of the thermals and so on. But talking about thermals, well, let's take a look then. What are the thermals like and how much power do they draw? So if you look at the Tuf and ProArt side by side, these cards both draw exactly the same amount of power in default settings in Thermark when I'm absolutely maxing them out. Now, neither of these cards at their full power draw, I couldn't get the fans to run at 100% speed. So the cards will let them run a little bit louder. So both of the GPUs make the cards run a little bit higher in temperature just to make them quieter. But there is a lot more thermal room because the fans are running 60, 70%, something like that. So there's extra room in there. The Tuf has quite a bit more extra, but the ProArt still has a lot more extra, so it still tries to keep it cool, which is interesting. Now, what about upping the power limit on MSI Afterburner? Maybe the Tuf is going to let you overclock it a bit more. Well, looking at both of them, they both allow the same amount, 110% power limit, which means both of these are going to draw roughly about 337, 336 watts within 1-2 watt difference. So again, these cards both perform the same. Now, when looking at the temperatures, the ProArt card is running quite a bit warmer than the Tuf. The ProArt is somewhere around 75 degrees, but I did have extra, 5 to 7 degrees warmer in the ambient room, so we can take that one off. So extra 10 degrees maybe roughly on the ProArt compared to the Tuf, but the ProArt is still running 75-ish degrees, which is in a very hot environment about 25.4 degrees in the room. The ProArt is performing and keeping the car cool very, very well. There's no thermal issues or thermal strains. Now, the Tuf is much, much cooler, but they're about the same. In fact, if I'm actually looking at the GPU clock speeds, then the Tuf has a lower clock speeds compared to the ProArt. The ProArt in Fairmark is running a little bit of a higher GPU clock speeds, about 2.34 sometimes boosting to there, whereas the Tuf only has 2.2 or something like that. The ProArt boost is a little bit lower, but the actual base, so when it's running there, is 2.3, 2.4. The Tuf is 2.1, so extra couple hundred megahertz. What I'm seeing the ProArt a little bit higher, but in benchmarks they're both exactly the same, so I don't see any difference in there. The only difference is that the Tuf has an overkill cooler to keep the card very, very cool. So if that is important to you, then that's that. I think the biggest elephant in the room is the price. Which one should you be getting? If the aesthetics are the only concern, I highly recommend ProArt, because we need more GPUs like this on the market that look absolutely insanely fantastic. Now, the Tuf aren't the worst card in there, but I think 4080 Super, probably the MSI Expert 4080 Super is, I think, second nicest card that you can get next to the ProArt. But between these two, which one is cheaper? Now, the thing is, when you are a creator, and if you're already paying for Adobe Creative Cloud membership, this ProArt is quite a bit cheaper compared to the Tuf, because you can get 3 months for free Adobe Creative Cloud membership, the full Creative Suite membership, which can go up to $180 if I'm not mistaken. So if you calculate that cost of the ProArt card, then the ProArt looks quite a bit more affordable compared to the Tuf. On Newegg right now, what I'm seeing, the price difference, the ProArt is $10 more expensive in the standard price. If you calculate the $180 off, then you can get it $170 cheaper compared to the Tuf, which is 10-15% lower price point for the same performance. But on Amazon, the pricing is a little bit different. So what I highly recommend you to do is, if you want to pick these up, I'm going to leave the links in the description below. And at the point when you're watching this, then check out the pricing on both of these stores, because then you can make sure that you'll get, you know, the best pricing on one of them or the other one. Maybe one runs the deal, but the other one doesn't, but that's that. So don't get deceived by just going and always buying from one shop where you've always bought. Just look around a little bit of the pricing. Now, in my opinion, this ProArt is the nicest GPU that you can get, and you can see that it doesn't have to be big to be powerful. There is only one thing I wish the ProArt did, is the 4090. Now, 4080 is kind of a, you know, okay there, but I think the 4090 would have been perfect. Now, I understand that 4090 could not be handled with this cooler. You'd need a little bit of a bigger cooler. This only can handle, you know, maybe 350. There's extra 100 plus watts that we have to push through somehow. So the card will be running very, very hot. But give us a 4090 that's, I don't know, a little bit longer, add a fourth fan, or make it slightly thicker, because you can put 2 of them in some of these GPUs, like a ProArt board, you can put 2 of them in there. Do I recommend this ProArt? Absolutely. I think it's smaller, performs the same, cheaper, looks nicer. Now, if you're new here, consider subscribing, because more videos like these are coming out and are on the channel already. And if you do want to reach out to me, I always get back to all of my Minect messages. So check out Minect in the description below next to those GPUs. Thanks guys for watching. Bye bye.